think of Christmas, and what comes to mind? Santa Claus presents under the tree and, of course, his cheerful little helpers, the elves. We see them in movies, on greeting cards, and maybe even on a shelf in our own homes. They're adorable, with their pointy hats, rosy cheeks, and tireless dedication to making toys for good boys and girls. They are the heart of Santa's workshop, the magical workforce that makes Christmas happen. But what if I told you that this image of the friendly, festive elf is a very recent invention? What if I told you that the original elves of folklore were anything but cute and cuddly? Prepare to have your vision of Christmas turned upside down. Because today, we're journeying back in time past the twinkling lights and a jolly Santa Claus to uncover the dark and often terrifying origins of Christmas elves. Before they were building toys, they were beings of immense power, creatures that you would not want to meet on a dark winter's night. Our story begins not in the North Pole, but in the misty forests and ancient landscapes of Norse and Germanic mythology. Long before Christianity spread across Europe, the people of these lands had their own rich tapestry of beliefs, filled with gods, giants, and a whole host of other supernatural beings. And among them were the elves, or as they were known, the Alfar. These were not the tiny, childlike figures we know today. The original Alfar were described as human-sized, sometimes even more beautiful and radiant than humans. They were demigod-like beings, possessing magical powers and an ethereal grace. They were divided into two main groups, the Lusulfar, or light elves, and the Kalfar, the dark elves. The light elves lived in a realm called Alfheim, a celestial kingdom ruled by the god Freyr. They were said to be fairer than the sun to look at, beings of light, art, and music. They were generally seen as benevolent, or at least neutral, towards humanity. They were spirits of nature, guardians of the forests and rivers. People might leave offerings for them, hoping to gain their favor for a good harvest or healthy livestock. But even these benevolent elves were not to be trifled with. They were powerful, otherworldly, and fiercely protective of their domains. Crossing them could lead to misfortune. And then there were the dark elves, the Kalfar. Some scholars believe these were another name for dwarves, living underground, masters of smithing and crafting. They were often depicted as more malevolent, hoarding treasure and holding grudges. But the real fear wasn't just about grumpy underground craftsmen. The folklore of elves became much more sinister as it evolved and blended with local superstitions across Scandinavia and Germany. Forget the North Pole workshop. The original elves' home was the natural world, and they were deeply territorial. In Scandinavian folklore, they were known as the Hulderfolk, or hidden people. They lived in mounds, hills, and underneath the floors of human houses. And you had to be very careful not to offend them. Building your house over their dwelling, or even pouring dirty water out onto the ground without a warning, could incur their wrath. And their wrath was terrifying. An angry elf wouldn't just put you on a naughty list. They were believed to cause illness and misfortune. Sudden, unexplained sickness in people or livestock was often blamed on elf shot, invisible arrows fired by resentful elves. This wasn't just a quaint belief. It was a genuine fear. People would perform rituals and use charms to protect themselves from these unseen attacks. Imagine living with the constant anxiety that a mysterious illness could strike your family or ruin your livelihood, all because you accidentally disturbed a hidden neighbor. The tales get even creepier. Elves were notorious for being kidnappers. They were said to steal human babies from their cradles and replace them with their own sickly, deformed offspring, known as changelings. This was a heartbreakingly common explanation for babies who were born with disabilities or failed to thrive. The changeling would be perpetually crying and impossible to console, slowly draining the energy and resources of its human family. It's a dark and tragic piece of folklore, but it shows just how deeply the fear of elves was woven into the fabric of daily life. They didn't just steal babies. Beautiful young men and women were also at risk of being lured away into the elf mounds, enchanted by their otherworldly music and beauty. To mortals who entered the elf world, time moved differently. A night of dancing with the elves could be 100 years in the human world. Those who managed to escape were often driven mad by the experience, forever caught between two worlds, unable to readjust to mortal life. So how on earth did we get from these powerful, dangerous, baby-snatching spirits to the cute little guys in green felt suits hammering away in Santa's workshop? The transformation was a slow process, happening over several centuries, but it really accelerated in the 19th century. As Christianity took hold across Europe, the old gods and spirits were either demonized or diminished. The powerful, human-sized Alfar of Norse myth were gradually downsized in folklore. They became smaller, more like mischievous sprites or fairies. Like the brownies of Scotland, who might help with chores if you left them a bowl of cream, or cause chaos if you offended them. The fear was still there, but their power was fading in the popular imagination. The real turning point came in the 1800s, especially in America. The Christmas traditions we know and love today were largely shaped during the Victorian era. Writers and artists were busy creating a new, family-friendly mythology for the holiday. In 1823, Clement Seymour's famous poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, also known as Tum's the Night Before Christmas, describes St. Nick as a right jolly old elf. This was the first major connection between elves and Santa Claus, although here elf was likely just used to describe Santa himself as a magical, otherworldly being. The idea of elves as Santa's helpers came a few decades later. An 1857 issue of Harper's Weekly featured a poem and illustration depicting Santa's workshop, not at the North Pole, but in a snowy landscape, surrounded by elves who were busy making toys. Then, in 1873, the popular American magazine Godey's Lady's Book featured a cover illustration showing Santa, his sleigh, and a workshop full of small, busy elves. This image was a massive hit. It was published and republished, cementing the idea of elves as Santa's little helpers in the public consciousness. Why did this new version of the elf become so popular? The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The idea of a bustling workshop filled with diligent, magical workers was a perfect fantasy for the era. It took the concept of mass production and made it magical and charming. These weren't exploited workers. They were joyful, magical beings who loved their work. They sanitized the idea of labor and wrapped it in a festive bow. This new, Americanized elf was cheerful, subservient, and completely non-threatening. He was the perfect employee for the newly crowned king of Christmas, Santa Claus. Gone were the kidnappings, the elf shot, and the changelings. Instead, we got toy assembly lines, pointy shoes, and a cheerful disposition. The powerful, morally ambiguous spirits of the old world had been tamed, domesticated, and put to work for Christmas. The final step in their evolution came in the 20th century with movies, television specials, and advertising. Think of Hermie the Elf from the 1964 classic, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, who wanted to be a dentist. Or Buddy from the movie Elf, a human raised by elves. These portrayals solidified the image of elves as quirky, lovable, and utterly devoted to the spirit of Christmas. They are now an inseparable part of the commercialized Christmas machine, their dark and powerful past almost completely forgotten. Even the recent elf on the shelf phenomenon plays on a sanitized version of the old fears. This elf is a scout from the North Pole who watches children to report back to Santa on whether they've been naughty or nice. He's a spy, a tiny surveillance agent. It's a playful take on being watched, a far cry from the life or death fear of being struck by an elf-shot arrow. But the core idea of a supernatural being observing human behavior is still there, lurking just beneath the surface. So this Christmas, when you see a cute little elf on a decoration or in a movie, take a moment to remember their ancestors. Remember the majestic, godlike Liosalfar, shining brighter than the sun. Remember the Hulderfolk, the hidden people dwelling in the earth, who demanded respect and punished those who crossed them. And remember the terrifying fear they once inspired in people, a fear as real as the winter cold. The story of the Christmas elf is a perfect example of how folklore evolves. How we take ancient stories, strip away the parts that scare us, and reshape them to fit our modern values. We've transformed powerful, feared nature spirits into symbols of childhood innocence and holiday cheer. It's a fascinating journey from the dark, enchanted forests of ancient Scandinavia to the bright, festive workshops of the North Pole. And it reminds us that behind many of our coziest traditions, there often lies a history that is much darker and far more interesting than we could ever imagine. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the holidays, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that uncover the strange truths behind the things we think we know. See you next time.